In April of 2021, the U.S. Census released its results from the 2020 census, describing how states had changed population since 2010. The release of the census data is of interest to many groups: demographers, historians, economists, and of course, political journalists. In the next few weeks, there would be many articles written about which party had won or lost from the census, and how reapportionment and redistricting would affect the political calculus. The US is very polarized right now, and everyone was looking for an answer to who had won the zero sum game of growth. While many of these stories make sense in context, I decided to look at results by plotting the growth rate of each state against the popular vote share in each state for the 2020 election. And what I found was. Overall, the correlation between Biden's margin in the 2020 election and the growth rate of states in the census was 0.01, basically no different from statistical noise. There are Democratic leaning states that lost population, like Illinois. There are Democratic leaning states that grew rapidly, like Colorado. And there are Republican voting states that were the fastest growing in the nation, such as Utah and Idaho, as well as having the sharpest loss in population in West Virginia. Texas and Florida are both rapidly growing states that voted for Donald Trump, but by narrow margins. Nevada, on the other hand, grew rapidly and voted for Joe Biden, but also by a narrow margin. Putting all these values together shows that there is no simple story about partisanship and state growth. Focusing in on certain areas of the country, we can see that sometimes regions have patterns, but sometimes not. One of the areas of the country that has traditionally been a swing region is the Rust Belt or Frost Belt, states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. These states very narrowly voted for Biden in 2020 and are currently lagging the nation in population growth. Close to these states are Ohio and Iowa, which are now slightly more Republican partisan, but which share similar demographics. But also close to these states on our chart are the Democratic-leaning states of Maine and New Mexico. This is an interesting result because while close to our Frost Belt states in partisan lean and slow growth rate, Maine and New Mexico are quite different from each other in demographics, geography, and sociopolitical history. Another platitude in American demographics is that population change has been concentrated in the South for decades. In a way, this is true. The coastal South has been increasing in population, but the inland South, such as Arkansas, Alabama, and Kentucky, show a similar slow population growth to the Frost Belt, and Mississippi actually lost population. In terms of population dynamics, Louisiana is much closer to Wisconsin than Georgia, even though Louisiana and Wisconsin have very different climates. Although it somewhat simplifies the situation, this map shows how partisanship and growth are a patchwork. In this map, blue stands for Democratic states that grew above the national average. Turquoise is Democratic states that lost compared to the national average. Conversely, red is Republican states with above average growth, and orange is Republican states with below average growth. In general, the West Coast, Mountain West, and Southeast are all growing, while it is the Mississippi River and Great Lakes region that is losing. But even within that simplification, there are exceptions. One of the ironic things about the chart is that the 2 points that are farthest from each other on the chart are not distance in geography. Washington, D.C. is growing briskly and is quite left-leaning. West Virginia, on the other hand, is losing population and very right-leaning. And yet, traveling from West Virginia to Washington, D.C. is easier to do than driving partway across, say, Idaho. Many of the sharpest demographic and political divisions in the United States come from areas that are in the same general region. There are many ways to talk about the United States. The way that I operationalized my data here is not the only or perhaps the best way to look at things. But one thing I do believe is that glib generalizations about the United States being divided into blue states and red states ignores the fact that the United States is very diverse in its demographics and politics, a difference that can be shown both in quantitative data as well as in subjective qualitative experience.